These are the recommendations there. COVID then, just to put this into context, it's not the first disease we ever had. Ever since we had milestones in education, we start the first schools, we had smallpox, and then we start schools for girls, and then we have Bill of Rights in education, then we have yellow fever, and then we have first public schools happening, and then we have first teacher education programs, but then we have scarlet fever and tuberculosis. We have always, throughout our history, had a big mixture of disease and advancement. But the one commonality is that people took the time, when the Spanish flu closed everything down, we took the time to reshift, regauge, rethink, reimagine what should education be when we come back. And that's something that we're being forced to sort of look at right now. How do we look at the future? So we've always had, you can see that the diseases start to get fewer, but starting about the 50s and 60s, we started to have tons of policies, many of which have not been revamped for the past 60 or 70 years, and they are very old. We need to update a lot of these policies that we have in educational planning. And so basically, if you look at where we've come from, we start having less and less disease, but more and more legislation, but some of that has not actually been to the benefit of many of our students. And so we have to really think about what has worked in terms of policy and to accept. COVID was a big deal. Looking to the future, what does this mean for our changes in education? Basically, the United Nations points out that we should be so happy. There have never been so many people so healthy for so long, getting so much education with so much access. And we're lamenting, we're not there yet, we're not there yet. So let's celebrate our wins, but also acknowledge how much farther we have to go. They also say be prepared because this is not the last pandemic, unfortunately. And they also say other things are going to be far worse. Climate change will probably wreak more havoc on your students' schedules and studying and how we learn in the future than anything else. And so there's a lot to prepare for. But what we realized during COVID is the interventions that we took for kids with special needs or other people actually had benefits for people that we had been excluding from schools. People with long-term illnesses, or low-income people, or people in prisons, or girls who got pregnant, or kids who hated school. Right now, Tennessee still has a chronic absenteeism of 30%. Kids are not going back to school. There's also this very interesting statistic that says 30% of learners during COVID preferred being online. Does that tell you something? I mean, there's something going on here that we need to sort of pick up on. So there's ways to react to that. The third point I wanted to talk about is going from the past to the future, and this is sort of my very oversimplified model of teacher education, how we have trained teachers in the past. Between the 1600s and 1989, if you knew a lot of stuff, you could be a great teacher. Just knowing stuff, we put you on the stage, you know stuff, you can communicate that. That was enough, because not everybody knew things, right? But then, around 1989, Schulman pointed out, no, you also have to know how to teach. Knowing your stuff doesn't mean you know how to teach it, right? But then you get this even further refinement that knowing how to teach math doesn't mean you know how to teach art. And knowing how to teach primary doesn't mean you know how to teach secondary. So you have to have this specialized pedagogical content knowledge. There are certain errors that we can anticipate that a kid will make when they start to learn to do multiplication. And if you're an expert, you see that. You can anticipate that. That's pedagogical content knowledge. But only about 2002, 2004, did we introduce this TPAC model of saying technology has to play a bigger role. We demand more of our teachers. We need to offload some stuff to technology. What is it that we can offload successfully to technology? And only in 2007 did we introduce this idea that people need to know more about the learning sciences. The International Mind-Brain Education Society was founded in 2007 and brought together this idea to push for what we now see in the Deans for Impact, for example, consortiums of teacher colleges moving towards integrating information about the brain and learning into their teacher training programs. But none of this works if it's not culturally relevant. So you have to put all of this information into context. What does this mean? This is why the movement towards culturally relevant pedagogy is more important than ever. If you do this, we become learning scientists. And this is what I think will be one nice way to move us away from the old teacher model. In our old teacher model, a teacher is a teacher is a teacher. We don't change. You don't have a ranking. You don't know who's better or who's worse. But if you are a learning scientist, there's a hierarchy of knowledge out there that you have to acquire in all of these areas. You have to know your field, you have to know how to teach it, you have to know technology, and you have to know about the brain. All of those things are important. And so I'd like to propose we adapt our language towards something like educational scientist, being a learning scientist in the future. The fourth idea is COVID, and this is the time and space idea. We were asking you in the video to reflect on, what are these ideas of shifting from being in a space and being in time? How do we actually do that? And before the pandemic, if you recall in the video, we talked about space. We go to school and we have homework. But since COVID, we now talk about asynchronous and synchronous activities, things that have to happen in one person's time or another. And one of the big ideas that came out of that was this shift in school calendars, which has been underfoot for more than 40 years. The state of Hawaii now has year-round schooling all the time. And everybody who does year-round schooling reports lower absenteeism, lower burnout, and even higher test scores. So why don't we do it? It's just a shift in mentality. You have exactly the same number of school days, they're just divided more equally. You don't have the summer learning gap when you do that. There's a big need to do this. However, people say, oh, it's too hard, I'd have to convince too many different people. So some of your comments are really funny. There's one person like, I love this idea of year-round schooling. I love this, right? And then you got somebody else who's saying, are you kidding me? I'd lose my job if I tried to suggest this to somebody else. So we've got this extreme, in this room alone, we have this extreme of responses. And what I would say to anybody who wants evidence, just ask me. We have a whole bundle of all of the evidence in favor of year-round schooling. If you need some ammunition, write to me. The problem is we are not making decisions based on evidence. We're making them based on tradition. If any of you have ever heard of Ian Jukes, Ian Jukes is this really great guy who used to say, twatty, twatty, every time you give an excuse. Well, we can't do that because we've never done it. Twatty. That stands for, that's the way we've always done it. You just say twatty, twatty. You're making up excuses here. So there's a lot of people who pointed out your comments were wonderful. They're saying this is a lot of challenges because we got to get a lot of different people on board, right? But there's some people who see this opportunity. This one person wrote, we've already started to have this summer institute, but what would happen if we did that for everybody, not just this select group of kids? What if everybody benefited from this? So you guys are already reimagining current systems and how they could work. Get away from the twatty, please, if possible, right? There's this poor fellow, I don't know who, I'm sorry if you're here right now, I'd just love to give you a little hug. I've struggled with this for more than 2 decades, and it was a conversation for 2 decades before that. So I've somewhat lost hope that this will significantly change in my lifetime. If you're here, come and talk to me afterwards, because I'd love to help nudge your school system into this. The main problem that we have is that we're not using evidence, we're using tradition. So we have to get away from those kinds of decision-making processes, okay? There are other policy things that have to change. Somebody commented, well, attendance is still based on seat time, right? And it made us question other things. Do you measure quality through quantity? Like the number of hours a kid sits in a school, is that seriously how you're measuring if they're learning? That's really off. That's really off, right? We have to question ourselves on a bigger scale. Why do we only go to school in the United States on average for 180 days of 365 in the whole year? That's really interesting. Harvard now has what it calls a 60-year curriculum. They believe that you're going to go to school every day of your life for the next 60 years because you're always going to have to upskill and reskill and do new things. And so we have to get used to a different kind of mentality around time, okay? But many of you pointed out there's tons of training opportunities. Teachers were thrown into this emergency remote mode for a while, but they gained some really valuable skill sets. How can we now leverage that to teach others who didn't quite get it, right? How can you use that for new training in the future? Another thing.